So if you pick this one, I think you're fine. But if you picked one later, I think you're fine too. I think you could make the argument either way. Not all stories, slavishly follow the model. The model is just a way of understanding stories. The way they format the story itself. Anyway, does a knife represent civilization? Is this a symbolic encounter? I think it is. The man in his civilized way trying to murder the dog may be representative of nature, incapable of doing it because of the cold. The man looked down at his hands to locate them and found them hanging on the ends of his arms. I mean, the language choice here, the diction that London uses, is designed to alarm you and to scare you, and I think it does a good job. The tension is clearly huge. But remember, the climax, if you're arguing the climax is the turning point in the action where there is no way to go back, this might represent it. He thought it curious that it was necessary to use his eyes to discover where his hands were. He began waving his arms, beating the mittened hands against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes. His heart produced enough blood to stop his shaking, but no feeling was created in his hands. A certain fear of death came upon him. He realized it was no longer a mere problem of freezing his fingers and toes or losing his hands and feet. Now it was a problem of life and death with circumstances against him. The fear made him lose control of himself, and he turned and ran along the creek bed on the old trail. The dog joined him and followed closely behind. The man ran blindly in fear, such as he had never known in his life. Slowly, as he struggled through the snow, he began to see things again. The banks of the creek, the bare trees and the sky. The running made him feel better. He did not shake anymore. Maybe if he continued to run, his feet would stop freezing. Maybe if he ran far enough, he would find the camp and the boys. Without a doubt, he would lose some fingers and toes and some of his face, but the boys would take care of him and save the rest of him when he got there. And at the same time, there was another thing in his mind that said that he would never get to the camp and the boys. It told him that it was too many miles away, that the freezing had got too great a start, and that he would soon be dead. He pushed this thought to the back of his mind and refused to consider it. A little bit of personification there. Sometimes it came forward and demanded to be heard, but he pushed it away and tried to think of other things. It seemed strange to him that he could run on feet so frozen that he could not feel them when they struck the earth and took the weight of his body. He seemed to be flying along above the surface and to have no connection with the earth. Yeah, I told you about this earlier, right? We're getting a repeated idea here. His idea of running until he arrived at camp and the boys presented one problem. He lacked the endurance. Several times he caught himself as he was falling. Finally, he dropped to the ground, unable to stop his fall. When he tried to rise, he failed. He must sit and rest, he decided. Next time, he would merely walk and keep going. And as he sat, he regained his breath, and he noticed that he was feeling warm and comfortable. Again, look up the symptoms of hypothermia. This is something that happens as well. You stop shaking as the blood goes into your center, and you get a warm feeling despite how cold you are because you have no feeling. You don't feel the cold. All of the outer skin is dead. It's unfortunate. He was not shaking, and it even seemed that a warm glow had come to his body. And yet, when he touched his nose or face, there was no feeling. Running would not bring life to them, nor would it help his hands and feet. Then the thought came to him that the frozen portions of his body must be increasing. He tried to keep this thought out of his mind and to forget it. He knew that such thoughts caused a feeling of fright in him, and he was afraid of such feelings. But the thought returned and continued until he could picture his body totally frozen. This was too much, and again he ran wildly along the trail. Once he slowed to a walk, but the thought that the freezing of his body was increasing made him run again. And all the time the dog ran with him at his heels. Again, the juxtaposition of the dog and the man. When he fell a second time, the dog curled its tail over its feet and sat in front of him, facing him, curiously eager. The warmth and security of the animal angered him. He cursed it until it flattened its ears. This time, the shaking of the cold began more quickly. He was losing his battle with the frost. There's a metaphor. And if you needed any more evidence that the enemy he is facing is actually the cold, there it is, clear as day. It was moving to his body from all sides. This thought drove him forward, but he ran no more than 100 feet when he fell head first. It was his last moment of fear. When he had recovered his breath and his control, he sat and thought about meeting death with dignity. Again, personification, like death could meet him. This may also be an allusion to the Grim Reaper, that creepy skeleton guy with the scythe who's going to show up and take him away, and he's going to meet him with dignity. However, the idea did not come to him in exactly this manner. His idea was that he had been acting like a fool, simile. He had been running around like a chicken with its head cut off, simile. He was certain to freeze in his present circumstances, and he should accept it calmly. With this newfound peace of mind came the first sleepiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep his way to death. Freezing was not as bad as people thought. There were many worse ways to die. He pictured the boys finding his body the next day. Clearly, we're into the falling action now. He fell. You could argue, so that might be your second climax moment that you could argue. When he falls down and he gives up and has this transition. You could argue that. And now we got falling action. Things are sort of coming together. He pictured the boys finding his body the next day. Suddenly, he saw himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself. Sort of an out-of-body experience here. And still with them, he came around a turn of the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself anymore. Even then, he was outside of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. Nice repetition of that thing from earlier. When he returned to the United States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. His mind went from this to the thought of the old man in Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, warm and comfortable and smoking a pipe. "You were right, old fellow, you were right," he murmured to the old man of Sulphur Creek. So let's transition to the resolution here. He's admitting that the old man knew what he was saying and that he shouldn't have been so arrogant and gone off and done this thing anyway. It's also the only dialogue in the entire story, even though it's not responded to. It's the only time somebody says something outright. Then the man dropped into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. The brief day ended in a long evening. There were no signs of a fire to be made. Never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the evening grew darker, its eager longing for the fire mastered it. With much lifting of its feet, it cried softly. Then it flattened its ears, expecting the man's curse. But the man remained silent. Later, the dog howled loudly, and still later, it moved close to the man and caught the smell of death. This made the animal back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars. It leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and ran along the trail toward the camp. The camp it knew, where there were other food providers and fire providers. And so at the end, the dog walks away from this situation and the man is frozen solid. And that's the resolution. That's thematic. So if the dog represents nature and the man represents civilization, you've got this clear answer and evidence. We've also got a clear conclusion to the idea about the advice that the man at Sulphur Creek had given to the man who is the protagonist of the story. So we can talk about this thing thematically, but I have read the story and talked about it for 51 minutes and 24 seconds, my phone tells me. So I'm going to stop here for today, and then we'll talk paragraphs tomorrow. I'll make another recording. We'll talk about those paragraphs that people wrote. I'll try and read some of the good ones so you get a sense of what some of your peers are doing. Maybe it'll give you some sense of community, even though you're all sitting at home. And we'll talk about some of the conclusions that can be made from the story. But as of right now, when you go through and you look at your annotations and you look at your themes and symbols and lessons and like all of those things, think about how you did. I've read the story to you. I've highlighted the things that I see in a single read out loud. Maybe that's useful to you. Maybe this can be a model for you in how you read stories and how you think about them. But in any case, I'm going to sign off. I wish you all the best. And I will talk to you tomorrow. Enjoy this beautiful weather.